Of the 243 years the United States has been a country, 77% of those years have had legal oppressions against black people. 77%. And that's not even counting the 169 plus years before we became a country. But just for argument's sake, we're going to focus on a recent time frame here of when the United States was its own independent country. These last few weeks, I've done a lot of listening and I've asked questions, and mainly I've just been trying to figure out how there are even counter arguments to these glaring human rights issues and the systems in place that perpetuate these issues, right? As I see it, the core problem here is a disconnect in the way people view the systemic oppression of black people in this country. I feel I need to speak up and share because I believe I can educate people who may not understand what that means. So if you don't understand what systemic racism is or why it matters, I humbly ask you to listen. I hope this video can be a bridge for you to understand and acknowledge what white privilege is, and I hope that it helps you open your ears to black voices. So let's review some history. Black people were enslaved in the United States until 1865. Yes, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed well before this, but because Texas was so far west and communication was so slow back then, news traveled slowly. So it wasn't until June 19th, 1865, when the orders were officially read in Texas that all enslaved people were officially considered free. This is why we should be celebrating Juneteenth every year, just as though we celebrate any other historic holiday, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Independence Day, any of them. It's truly a historic moment. But as many of you know, this was not the end of racism by any means, nor was us electing Obama as president, for God's sakes. But after slavery had ended, we had another 100 years of Jim Crow laws. Progress, of course, but these laws and the false ideals that they represented were responsible for yet another century of injustice. These laws enforced racial segregation, they enforced restrictions on when and where formerly enslaved people could work and for how much money, and they dictated which neighborhoods black people could live in. These laws were essentially a free pass to treat black people like shit, even after they were freed from slavery. These laws and the culture around them were also responsible for countless lynchings, unjust incarcerations, murders, and just plain shady politics. All of this went on until 1965 when the Jim Crow laws were finally lifted. But culturally, all this hasn't stopped to varying degrees. Now, I know no one watching this would argue that any of that was acceptable, but a counterpoint I've heard is, but that was decades ago. We're in a better place now. While there is truth in the above statement, it isn't looking at the bigger picture. It's ignoring that this country has been aggressively oppressing black people for far longer than it hasn't been. All of which, mind you, was entirely at the hand of white people being in power for centuries and wanting to keep it that way. So you might be asking, what does all this have to do with that garbage person kneeling on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as he called out for his dead mother, pleading for his life? As a country, we have a long and horrifying history with racism, especially against black people. And the long-term effects of this incredibly lengthy time span don't just go away because a few decades have passed. This can be seen historically even by how long Jim Crow laws were in effect. These racist regulations were law for 100 years post-slavery. Just let that sink in. Can we simply agree we will likely be dealing with systemic problems related to race for a larger span of time than we'd maybe like to admit? This is obvious in our unconscious biases alone that we all have. I'm not saying you're racist, but we all have at least some unconscious biases woven into us. We are still dealing with the nuclear fallout of these 188 plus years of legalized oppression our ancestors and even our relatives institutionalized against black people. Living relatives, yes. This is a current generation's problem. This shit was not that long ago. However, in part, due to people not even being willing to acknowledge this history, we haven't made the progress we should have. Do all lives matter? Of course they do. No one is saying other lives are less than, or that other groups are not oppressed, that we shouldn't be concerned with kids in cages at our borders, or that there aren't just general socioeconomic issues with the lower middle class. What I am saying is that, like in our personal lives, just like in our personal lives, things get done when we, the people, focus on a single task far better than when we half-ass all the things that matter to us. To me, Black Lives Matter is about making true strides against all racism, systemic or otherwise, as a focused effort. Maybe you don't want to go out and protest. You should. But if not, what else can you do? What can we all do to move us forward? First, I think we need to be more self-aware, all of us. Acknowledge your unconscious biases and the biases of others. Be mindful of your thoughts and the jokes you make or how you describe others. We also need to educate others, ourselves, your children. The other element of this is to speak up now. Not being racist is great, obviously, yes. But while self-awareness and education are great, if the only thing you do is raise your children to align with your values, while that is incredibly powerful, it's also residual, and we need real activism now. Social media activism is activism. Calling out racism, not just towards your friends, but everyone, is activism. You don't have to make activism your full-time job, but make it a part of your existence. Tomorrow is Juneteenth, and I think a great first step for anyone who didn't even know what that was before just now would be to research it, find out why it's important, maybe even share something about it. We are at a clear tipping point here. We need to heal as a country, but in order to heal, we need to address our wounds. And that starts with you.